Everyone, welcome back. This is our next panel of the day. We're going to be talking about something specific. One thing we haven't really focused on in the first two panels was the issue that's been the compelling one in policing for most of last year and the year before. In fact, one could argue for the last 5 years, which is the use of excessive force by police, usually against unarmed civilians. There's obviously not a lot that we can say that's new to it, but what is new is an approach that's being taken now to analyze what's at fault rather than who's at fault when we talk about shootings of unarmed civilians. It's very easy for the press, for the public to pin the blame on a single officer and then complain about it, and when he or she doesn't get indicted or charged. But what's harder is to look at the systemic background, systemic roots of why that particular shooting or that particular event happened. And there's an approach that's now begun, actually started with the Department of Justice several years ago, called the Sentinel Events review process, which really looks at the systemic problems that cause errors in justice, whether it's shooting of an unarmed civilian, whether it's a wrongful conviction, or any other error that is common to the justice system. It was put out for a trial run in several places around the country, but its most successful and most interesting run was in Tucson, Arizona, last year, when there was a sentinel review process after a shooting in that city. The Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice was deeply involved in getting that experiment off the ground. They've just done a big report, which is now on your screen in the chat room. And our panel is going to be talking about that and about the lessons that we can learn from it. And to lead us in that panel is John Hollway, who is the director of the center of the Quattrone Center, and he will introduce our panelists as well. So welcome, John. The mic is yours.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to see you, and always great to come back to this meeting. I think this is, I think, a really important symposium that you have every year, and it's great to be here with the folks that are watching. It's also great to be here with my fellow panelists. Very nice of you to say that we were heavily involved in putting this together, but really this was a joint Tucson Police Department and community endeavor. And I think that's part of why we do feel it was really successful, and why the Quattrone Center was thrilled to take part. But really, Chad Kasmar, then Assistant Chief. Now, Chad, you're going to have to give me your new title now that you're in your new role. But Chad really put this together, and he and I were on a NACOL panel together about Sentinel Event reviews. And he called me after and he said, "Listen, tomorrow we're going to have an announcement, and it might lead to something that we could work together on." And so I really came on at the back end to help moderate. But as you said, there were two deaths in custody in the spring of 2020 in Tucson. These are individuals who were in police custody and then had critical events leading to their deaths. And the city of Tucson really wanted to look at those and understand why things that undesired outcomes, right? Why something that nobody wanted to have happen nonetheless happened. The Sentinel event process, which we'll talk about, is a way of doing that. And Chad and TPD assembled Margie and Tonya and other really fabulous and dedicated members of the community, and leading to the report. So we're thrilled to talk about that. I'm going to let each of the three of them introduce themselves, and I'm going to do it in alphabetical order. So Dr. Balfour, you get to go first.
Hi, so my name is Margie Balfour. I'm a psychiatrist here in Tucson, and I'm on faculty at the University of Arizona, and I work for an organization called Connections Health Solutions, and we operate the crisis center that is in Tucson. So Arizona actually has a pretty robust mental health crisis system, and you'll hear later that there was mental health issues involved in these cases, and some of these cases. And we operate the crisis center, which is the primary drop-off for law enforcement, and interact also with the mobile teams and the rest of the crisis community. I do a lot of national work on mental health crisis services and quality and police interactions. And so in addition to being a community leader, I was able to provide some perspective of what the mental health system needs to do in cases like these to collaborate with the police.
Thanks, Margie. And I think one of the things that we will want to touch on, one of the things that really impressed me that you brought to the table in our process was the ability to say, hey, there are ways to handle people that doesn't necessarily always involve handcuffs and restraints and things like that, and making sure that we are setting the police up for success with appropriate alternative methods of things was a really important part of our conversation that you really brought with that clinical expertise. So I look forward to talking to you about that. Tonya? Oh wait, Chad's next. K before S, sorry.
Thanks, John. Is my audio coming in okay?
Yeah, you're great.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. Appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation. My name is Chad Kasmar. Until about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, I was assigned as the Deputy Chief of the Tucson Police Department. That's the #2 to Chief Chris Magnus. And at that time and last summer, one of my primary roles over the past 5 years under the leadership of Chris Magnus was to oversee the evolution of our use of force review, including our highest levels of review, what we used to refer to as a board of inquiry, which led to the Critical Incident Review Board, and then ultimately a Force Review Board and the Sentinel Event Review Board. So it was a 5-year journey that I'm looking forward to deep diving into with all of you today. And about half of my career, about half of a 20-year police career has been involved with police oversight and accountability from the Office of Professional Standards up through different assignments in the Chief's office.
Thanks, Chad. And obviously, thanks for putting the whole thing together in the first place and then for following through with it in the way that you did. Now, Tonya, I jumped the gun last time, but please join us.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for allowing me to be here. My name is Tonya Strozier. I'm the very proud principal of a small elementary school on the south side of town. And I think what I bring to the table is not only my educational background, but just my role as a mom. I'm a mom of 6 Black children and 1 beautiful granddaughter, and so I bring that to the table. And for me, being a part of this was pretty transformational, I'm going to say that. And I think that just as an educator, as a parent, as educational consultant, I think that was the perspective that I was able to bring. And so I'm looking forward to really sharing my experience.
Thanks, Tonya. And I have to say, one of the things that when the Quattrone Center is going out and pitching, doing these event reviews to jurisdictions around the country, the statement that you just made is a big part of the sort of, I think, not necessarily right on the surface value, right? In addition to all of the reforms and recommendations that the group made, in my mind, one of the real values was watching the community members and the police learn to understand one another better. And so that there's, in the first place, somewhat of a healing process that goes on with the people in the room, but also hopefully with the community in ways that make it easier for the police to do the difficult job that we're putting in front of them. So I hope you'll help us get at that in the conversation too. So I know the chat is active and people are putting our bios and things in there. We are watching that. We're also watching the Q&A. And so as the conversation is going, if there are things you guys want to talk about, things that we're not hitting on, things of interest to you, please lob them in there and I'll insert them in the conversation. But Chad, for people who haven't really heard the word Sentinel Event Review in the past, maybe you could talk to us about the Sentinel Event Review Board that you've created at TPD and what the objectives were and the structure and things like that, just to sort of set the stage.
You bet, John. Thank you. So again, really, it was an evolution of under Chief Chris Magnus, and we had a pretty traditional use of force review process, like many other police departments in the country, that was primarily internally based. The police auditor, obviously independent police auditor would be part of that with some internal SME experts. But what lacked and what the chief quickly realized and challenged the organization to develop on was having extended community investment and participation in that process. So again, it was quite the evolution, and we certainly learned by stubbing our toe and not having the success that we wanted originally. And that process evolved into what was a critical incident review board. That included council participation. Our local elected officials had representation wherever the incident occurred. We brought in, for example, somebody like Ms. Balfour to come in as a subject matter expert if we had a suicide by a cop or something, some type of incident like that, where we wanted to draw from the expertise. But we were still missing the community perspective when it was a critical incident review board. The other problem that we had was the board at that time, under a board of inquiry and the critical incident review board, still were the finders of accountability of policy violations. which ultimately those findings would result in discipline. And so what we realized, it was a tough environment to want police officers to come into a room of 20 people, explain to the board why they did something in a candid fashion, but also open themselves up to further discipline and accountability. And so that was a real struggle for us. And so through the evolution of that conversation with labor, officers, at the conclusion of every finding, I would sit down and meet with the officers and explain the findings. And so I learned a lot through that process from all parties involved with it. And that really drove the evolution. And again, I give Chief Magnus credit for this is a difficult environment. Policing has always been a difficult environment to be creative and to develop new process, especially around such serious incidents where there's loss of life and there's criminal and administrative investigations. There's many layers of complexity to these reviews, and trying to create a safe space for a learning environment. So ultimately what we figured out was, and the timing couldn't have been more critical, was we needed to peel away the discipline from the review process if we really wanted to capture what a Sentinel Event Review Board is. It's certainly fashioned much like our aeronautical industry and the medical field, where we have to learn from our mistakes if we want to be better as organizations. And that's where you, John, and the Quattrone Center, and Mike Hollway from ASU and the problem-oriented policing came in perfect timing to help really take our review process to the next level. In my opinion, that's what we were able to create with the collective group work last summer. And I'll tell you, in my almost 21 years of law enforcement, it was the toughest summer that I've ever been through. We were certainly in Tucson experiencing, after the death of George Floyd, we were experiencing protests and civil unrest, all while we had our own two incidents. And so it was a critical need where everybody who's participating today played a role in helping the organization develop through a very critical and challenging time.
Thanks, Chad. So Tonya and Margie, so Chad comes to you in this setting and says, hey, can you help me out? Talk a little bit about what your expectations were of the process, what your experiences were with the process, whether your expectations were met. What did you guys expect to have happen, and then what happened?
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think my mindset first of all, I think it was Chad's demeanor. I think it was how he approached me, and I offered my help and he responded, but he didn't come, I don't know, I think it was the humility that Chad approached me with, and then just the invitation to contribute, that my voice mattered and that I was going to have an opportunity to be, on a level playing field in terms of contributing to this process. And so I came in with a heart of wanting to build a bridge to two very isolated groups. And that's what I said to Chad, is that, I want to be a part of the solution, and I want to be a bridge to bring these two groups together. And so this seemed like just a perfect opportunity. And I think my expectation was to just justice. I don't know. I think I just really wanted justice. And, I have a son and three sons. And so I came as a mother. And so my expectation is to be a part of righting some wrongs, building a bridge, and then learning. Except that the lessons that I learned were not the lessons I thought I was going to learn. I ended up learning so much more about the police culture, and just some things that I was doing internally, the dehumanizing that I was doing, though I didn't want them to dehumanize my people. So that was a real big lesson for me. But my expectation was to come very critical, not take this nice approach, but to come in with a critical perspective. And it was good to know that was received. As a matter of fact, it was invited, because Chad said, I don't expect you to be my cheerleader. I'm like, great, we're on the same page. So it worked out, because I wasn't coming to be that, but I wanted to bring that perspective. And I was really afforded a great opportunity to provide even some training for the group about systemic racism, which I think was very key to, kind of norming where the perspective that we're coming from. So I think my expectations were actually exceeded in this process, just from what I took away as my personal takeaways. And I think the only thing that I would have liked to see is maybe the perspective or the voice of an African-American man at the table. I think I would have wanted to see that, because if you look at the numbers, they probably should have been represented in that. And then I don't profess that, being African-American, I speak for all, because we shouldn't be taking a monolithic approach about, the Black experience. But I think that's the only thing that I would have liked to see, is maybe an African-American male at that table participating in that board. Though I know Chad is already working with other groups that represent that perspective.
Yeah, and I had the good fortune to have been working with Tucson PD for quite some time on various mental health initiatives, and then I had been one of the few external subject matter experts in the previous, I guess the precursor, the CIRB, the Critical Incident Review Board. So I had some experience in this, and then in healthcare, as a physician, we do root cause analysis as part of the healthcare quality improvement. So I had experienced, many RCAs, but they have almost become routine in healthcare, which on the one hand is a good thing, but what really struck me in doing this is it's not routine for law enforcement, and the seriousness with which this was undertaken, and just the intensity of it was, even coming from someone who has a background in these types of processes, to see how transformational and just a different way of thinking this was for the agency involved was striking and really interesting to see, and also just how having the community involved, like in healthcare we do these root cause analyses, but we don't have usually all these community stakeholders, and so that whole process was new to me and very I remember when you said what you said at the end, how you saw police as people now. And I remember being like, wow, that is really amazing that this process did that. I also thought that it was, one thing that I expected, that systemic racism was going to be addressed, but I didn't know how. And I personally learned a lot. I came in as a subject matter expert on specific things, but then I learned a lot about things that I wasn't an expert on. I've done lots of reading on systemic racism as it affects the African American community, because I try to stay informed and I'm learning. But both of these men who died were Latino males, and they're in Tucson. There's a huge Hispanic population, and so I learned a lot about the history of policing with that population, which doesn't get as much of the national attention. And so it was just a very a learning process, which I think is what the intent was.
Yeah, so you guys have touched on a number of things that I think were really important in distinguishing this process as a productive one. One of the things that I think TPD did very well was they brought a diverse set of voices, right? So we had participants from TPD, but also from the fire department, from the emergency dispatch group. Because there were medical issues involved, Margie, we had people like you, and we had a doctor from a critical care emergency room doctor from Tucson. But then, because what we're asking the police to do is go into the community and engage with the community and understand how their actions are perceived by people who might have different lenses than they have, people like Tonya were incredibly valuable to that process. And Tonya, what I really thought you did effectively, and this is an important principle of any sort of consensus process, right, was I like the way you described it, that you came in wanting very much to be both a critical assessor, but a bridge. And so, and one of the things that you did very effectively was you certainly, had a vibrant voice, but it was a voice that also listened, right? And in Sentinel event reviews, we ask why a lot. And actually there's, papers that have been written about the 5 whys and sort of asking why backwards several layers to really get to what the root cause is. And it can be very easy, especially in the emotionally charged situations that we're talking about in these, to not want to hear why, but to tell people what they should have done. And I think, what I'm hearing you reflect is when you ask why, you got answers that were sometimes more thoughtful and more surprising than you'd expected. Is that I don't want to put words in your mouth. No,
you're absolutely right. And I think that is probably a really critical piece of this whole entire process. I'm going to call it more of a journey than a process, is that we challenged the perspectives that were being brought to the table. And we have to be vulnerable enough to do that. And so I think anyone that would have the courage to do what Chad and this department did, you probably need to lead with some vulnerability and some courage, because the real work can't get done if we're not going to have real conversations. And I think that's something that I really wanted and I had the autonomy to do, is to challenge and have a real conversation. And I also think, John, that it was pivotal, because there was a point where we were kind of going back and forth after I did that training about systemic racism. We had a little bit of going back and forth, like how are we going to handle this? But what a key lever, John, is when you said, we're going to go ahead and assume systemic racism. When you said that, it was done. And then we were able to get past that hump and really deal in a very transparent and real way.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, Tonya, because I think given the sort of national dialogue in communities about policing, I think that's a really important issue. And what I would say is, what I thought was really important, you mentioned this, was the humility of the police department first in saying, we really want to know how to do this better. And so just for the audience, the process that we went through was Chad assembled this diverse group. And then Tonya said, hey, I'd like to do a level setting presentation for everybody on the topics of intergenerational racial trauma, systemic and institutional racism, and make sure we're all on the same page. I've been in rooms where departments would just, the doors would close, right? You could just see it in their eyes. They're like, okay, we wouldn't do this. And Chad, maybe talk a little bit about how you represented that within the department to enable that conversation. And then let's talk about what we did with it from there, as Tonya's referenced.
Sure, thanks. So really interesting conversation, even tying it into what Ms. Rice said in the last lecture, which was there's trust failure on all sides. There's a lack of patience and tolerance for change. And we need whole machine change. So the Sentinel event review process represents that whole machine. We have communications where the call comes in from the community member. We had fire and police present, but we also had community voices. We had Tonya, we had Ms. Claudia Yasso from Amistades, because it was important for us to recognize being an African-American community member in Tucson is very different than being a Latino community perspective, and those are different experiences. Like Tonya said, I was also being guided from other community groups on perspective on what it was like to be a Black man in Tucson, and the perspective and the emotional response to the things we were seeing at a national level and local. But in that room, we also brought in labor, right? Labor is also part of this national conversation, and often there's a lot of perspectives on how labor contribute to either gains or losses in the evolution of policing. So the important thing, I think, for everybody who's listening today to understand is in the difficulty of creating that safe space in the room for us to listen to each other. It wasn't about the police just telling you how we do things and to further educate everybody in the room on why, but it was a genuine interest in every law enforcement leader's perspective in that room to hear everybody's perspective and let that guide policy change and changing landscapes of expectations. And everybody in that room has a vote, and we operate off a consensus model. And what that means is, you might be in love with the idea or you might be just at 51%, but we have to have you at that 51% of consensus before we could move on to the next topic. And sometimes we came to consensus quickly on issues. And then other times, as we all know, we had very long days on very passionate, emotional conversations that were needed for us all to educate each other and then come up with the best solutions. And I think that's what we accomplished in that room over a period of weeks.
That's one thing to note too, is this wasn't just a meeting, like a one-day meeting. This was a month of full-day Wednesdays. So that level of communion, we don't do that in healthcare root cause analyses. You know, that level of commitment made it a much, you know, a very unique experience.
John, can I add something to that? I think something that Chad just brought attention to was that everyone had, in this consensus process, everyone had an equal vote. And I don't know if we really fully understand what that means. I mean, textually, that is what oppression is that you don't actually have the power. You don't actually have a voice. And so when we create this consensus process, what you're doing is actually righting some of the wrongs where some of the people haven't had a voice, haven't had the power. And in this process, when you bring together community members, you're actually righting a wrong by giving the power to everyone that is able to contribute in this process. Because that's what oppression is. That's part of systemic racism, is that there's an imbalance of power and how that power is used. And so that's one of the really key levers in this review, is that there's a balance of power and we all get to bring that to the table.
And I actually thought the group did that very effectively. In other words, I think that can be the conversation about systemic racism and institutionalized racism is so important and so large that when you start talking about individual discrete events, sometimes a root cause analysis, you know, if one of our reforms is, for example, that we should be changing the kind of equipment that an officer has on his belt or her belt, right? That may not be satisfying to people who want to have a conversation about institutionalized racism. It may materially change an interaction that people then look at and see evidence of that systemic racism, and may prevent that outcome from going badly. But when people want to have and everybody feels the need to eradicate that larger topic, and the question is, can we get there with these smaller tweaks, and is that satisfying, right? So I think what you all did once we got to that topic was we tried to address it. This is the point you mentioned. We tried to address it by saying, look, what we want to do is identify the moments where that systemic racism becomes visible. And for me, one of the real powerful moments was when we watched one of the videos. There were two deaths in custody that we reviewed. In one, it was found that the officers had acted within protocols and training, and in the other, it was found that the officers deviated pretty dramatically from what the expectation would have been about their behavior. When one of them involved a pretty lengthy physical altercation between a number of officers, and there was a moment where the physical altercation was done. A new group of officers came in to sort of pay attention to and oversee the suspect, who was now in handcuffs on his side. And the officers who had been the responding squad were sort of taken away, and they were having conversations with the other officers on the side. And what was really powerful for me in that moment was that what I saw evolving there, and what a lot of the community members, particularly the members of color, saw in that, were two very different things. And so, you know, I saw a bunch of officers sort of caring for officers who'd been in an adrenaline-fueled event and helping them come back into a normal, adrenaline rage. And Tonya, you and others, again, I apologize for putting words in your mouth, but basically said, hey, look, we see a complete disinterest in the value of Latino life here. And I think, you know, Chad, for you as an assistant chief, as a manager of police, like, how do you take that and counsel officers, because they've got to deal with both those perceptions of this in order to do what they do successfully?
Great question, John. So, and that's, you know, let me take a step back. Effectively, Chief Magnus and my full-time job and a very talented, dedicated team of executive leadership, once the George Floyd death occurred, was to immediately recognize the relationships we had in the community were deficient. They were deficient in us having effective communication. And when our community felt like they had to take over streets and damage property, and throw rocks and bottles for their voices to be heard, we realized we had to go back to the drawing board. And so that effectively, became my, my full-time assignment through the chief. And having some really difficult conversations. And we've of course, everybody who's participated with today's conversations has heard those in other conversations. So how do you, as police leadership, how do you have those courageous conversations within your own organization and say, hey, we're clearly not where we need to be? And then do you have the right leadership in place to go have some really challenging conversations out in the community? And I'll tell you, it was an enlightening experience for me. I am a homegrown Tucsonan. I have half of my family's Latino. But, you know, I walked into a lot of meetings where I was not welcome. I was the recipient of a lot of understandable anger and told to check my white privilege at the door and those types of things. So those are difficult things to work with. And it was a big challenge for us to challenge our leadership to recognize throughout our organization. We have a big department, police department. It was to, you know, how do we reinforce them and the skills and the courage to go out in the community and say, hey, we recognize where we missed the mark here. And you know, the reality is we recognized on one of the cases that you spoke about, John, with the Carl Ingram Lopez case, we had training in place, we had policy in place, we had supervision in place. All those things failed us that early morning. And so we had to recognize, okay, and if it failed with this group of individual officers, then we could potentially have failures elsewhere. So it was really immediately recognizing we were deficient and being transparent as possible about that, and then going back to the drawing board with community perspective to guide changes. And with that, what we certainly learned through Tonya and Claudia was, you know, when we listened to the 911 call and where things, you know, didn't go right, starting in our emergency communications, was when we quickly recognized while the reportee, the grandmother of Carlos Ingram Lopez, could speak English, she also spoke Spanish, probably primarily Spanish. And we missed the opportunity to try to engage her in a different way. With her native language, to, you know, which could have resulted in different outcomes out in the field. And we certainly, that just got worse when we went out. So when somebody, a community member of color, watched the video that I watched, as a police leader, when I watched it, what I watched was inaction. It wasn't what the officers did, it's what they didn't do. That caused and contributed to catastrophic events. But what the community of color saw was that level of service was provided potentially because of the color of their skin or who they were. And so that was really hard to hear. It was not something I had thought of. And I was ignorant to that, frankly. And so it was an educational journey for myself and the rest of the leadership team that was on this board, and of course the rest of the agency.
Tonya, Margie, anything you want to add on that topic? I mean, having gone through the experience.
Yeah, I think, John, I think what Chad is talking about is really the critical importance of the police department, all police departments having a measure of cultural competence, you know, and I don't mean that in like an assaulting way. I mean, just an awareness of different cultures, and not that you have to learn everything about every culture, but you have to understand that your culture is at play in everything that you do. You don't separate, just like in the field of education, you cannot separate culture from learning, which means that you also cannot separate culture from your policing. It is there, it is embedded in what you do. It's embedded in how policing was even developed. And so I think the importance of cultural competence needs to be recognized, but I also feel like just even this socio-political or critical consciousness needs to be added to this, because there is a difference in power, not just because of policing, but within cultures and how different cultures are treated nationally. So I think it's really important to understand that a lot of things are at play. And as Chad mentioned, not just what's not happening, but all the things that are happening that we may not recognize, because it's like telling a fish to tell me about water. They don't know anything other than water. And that's what happens when we get embedded in systemic racism. If you don't know anything else, it's just normal for you, but it isn't the norm for me. Does that make sense to everyone? So I really feel like having cultural competence and some critical consciousness really needs to be embedded, not just in policing, but in all disciplines.
So Margie, I want to turn to you on the healthcare thing in just a second, but we have a question in the chat that asks, Chad, if there are officers of color in TPD and whether that has helped to improve the relationships with communities or change internal police culture. Great
question. I just raised my hand to add that. Yes, we're of course like many agencies. We're almost equal reflection of our Latino population inside the department that reflects that of the community, but we're deficient in our African American officers. Now, what I'll share with you and what I wanted to add was, you know, our African American officers came forward and had the courage to tell the chief during this time, you all aren't doing as good as you think you are. And so by having this conversation within the community, it also created an environment within our own organization where our officers of color felt comfortable to come forward and say, hey, we're angry too. Here's the things that we're experiencing, but we also want to help you do better. And that started with Chief Magnus meeting with the officers who were impacted and wanted to speak to him privately. And then, of course, we grew that out to including larger executive leadership roles in that conversation. So, you know, I would put both of those items in the, we're working on it. We're never going to arrive. That's a journey that we clearly, that law enforcement, the journey's never going to stop during our career times, our lifetimes. But we're certainly in a better position than we were before last summer.
Thanks, Chad. So Margie, you were like this amazing revelation for me in this process because and you know, we had a couple of law students that were assisting and taking notes and stuff. And while everybody was talking, we had our side chat going about things that I wanted them to emphasize, make sure we remembered as we were coming back to the group and things. And they kept saying to me, every time Margie talks, I want to write down every word. And I think a big reason, there were a couple of reasons for that, right? One is obviously you're fabulous, but stepping back from you personally, what you brought to this was a novel way of looking at things and a calmness about the process of root cause analysis. And so you've mentioned that this happens in healthcare a lot. I think because all of the reviews we do in criminal justice are accountability reviews, right? Anytime we want to do anything after a bad event has happened, it's very easy to get into a defensive crouch. And when you're in that defensive crouch, you're not in that bridging, listening, you know, conversation that Tonya's talking about. You want to explain why what you did wasn't wrong and wasn't a problem and then, you know, whatever else. And it's not okay, let's take a step back and look at this and think about how we can prevent the next one. So talk about how that works in healthcare and how you make it sustainable and repeatable and non-threatening.
Sure. Yeah. And healthcare kind of had to go through this journey itself. There was a landmark report back in about 2000 or 2001 that was called "To Err is Human," where for the first time healthcare looked at itself and said, look, like medical errors are like the fourth leading cause of death. You know, we have hundreds of thousands of preventable medical errors per year, and we may think we're doing, you know, we're awesome in healthcare, but we're not. And then from that, another report came out, this is from the Institute of Medicine, called Crossing the Quality Chasm, that talked about this need to really be serious about quality and safety in healthcare and to borrow from other industries, such as the airline industry or the nuclear power industry, because in those industries, you know, you can't say, well, 99.9% is good enough, because if you said that, you get like 100 planes fall from the sky every day. So healthcare really went through quite a big culture shift in those early 2000s. And there has been a lot of work done to go from the blaming and shaming and, you know, who's going to get fired for this, you know, whenever there's a bad outcome mentality, to we need a quality and safety approach, and we're trying to get at the root of what's going on so we can fix it. You know, before I was in Tucson, I was at a hospital in Dallas that was under federal oversight for, you know, a series of problems. And that was a big thing, was the culture shift in that hospital. So it's still going on in healthcare, but when healthcare organizations are doing it right, there is a lot of work done in having what's called a just culture, where it's okay, you're actually encouraged to report when things aren't working so that they can be looked at. And then when it gets to the point where there's been an outcome that's bad enough that you need a root cause analysis, that's done in a way that, first of all, it's legally protected in healthcare. So because everyone's, you know, worried about lawsuits and stuff, because, you know, all you lawyers. But
hey, we got to earn a living like everybody.
Yeah. No, my brother's a lawyer, so I feel like I can make fun of attorneys. But people are rightly, afraid of that. So there's actually, they're protected, they're privileged, because there's a recognition that you can't have those really frank and hard conversations if you're worried that a transcript of what you say is going to be used against you in court. So that protection's important, but it's also, they need to be led by people who were trained in how to do this, and to be able to, kind of poke and prod and elicit those, but also make people feel comfortable, and involve the people that were actually there. So you don't just want management to sit around the table and judge what the people on the floor staff did. You want the people who are actually involved and go like, well, what is it, and why weren't you able to do your job? Because we know you wanted to do your job the way you should do your job. No one wants to come and do a bad job. So like, what is it in the system rather than the individual that led to these, led to whatever this bad outcome was?
So a couple things that I want to kind of touch on and follow up on, but one is the idea of a safe harbor for this from litigation, right? And there was a question that was put up earlier in the chat about whether any of the officers had been disciplined as a result of this, and we put the answer in there, which is that in one of the instances where the officers had deviated from policy, they ultimately resigned from the force. In the other situation, there wasn't discipline because it was deemed that wasn't necessary, but that accountability mechanism was happening in parallel. And so our conversation was free of having to do that. We could concentrate on a quality improvement sort of conversation. So that's number one. But then number two, so Chad, you guys did this, and I believe the city or the department is actually being sued or recently had a settlement, but there was litigation in at least one of these instances. But you also have then a situation where there's cynicism about whether the police are going to want to do this and are really doing it the right way. But then on your side, you've probably got cynicism about, I don't know, your average Ivy League law professor lobbing in recommendations about what you should do better, right? Like, I'm not, what do I know relative to anybody else? And so how do you take, did you feel that this process, that the officers in your department were pleased with this report and thought that it was helpful and thoughtful, or was it viewed as like intrusive and people who didn't really know what they were talking about coming in and criticizing?
Candidly, John, probably a little bit of both. And I think the reason is, it goes back to Miss Rice's statements of lack of patience and tolerance, and everybody feels so under pressure right now, whether it's public safety or community, people of color, activists, and it's this. So we're yelling at each other and we're not listening. It's a difficult environment for us to work together and to genuinely listen and to come up with meaningful solutions. It's certainly not a safe environment to do that, and it wasn't last summer. And so I think the officers were used to that level of review because of the changes under Chief Magnus, and they were used to that, frankly. So we had that. We had 4 years of experience with that already. But they, I can't tell you that everybody in briefings, when they had to go over roll call and go over the recommendations, that everybody was in love with those, candidly, right? Behavior change takes a long time. For all of us to change one behavior in our lives is extremely difficult. Give up soda, give up snacks, give up alcohol, cigarettes, you name it, make one serious life change behavior. But that's what we're asking from the profession of law enforcement, is take sweeping changes and not really recognizing how difficult that is to do, especially in large organizations. And if we don't have the buy-in from the training officer and every field supervisor in the leadership, and the wrong people are in those leadership roles, then you've got a problem. And this review did result in leadership changes in a variety of areas for people that weren't on board as fast as they should have been. So candidly, what I would say was, one thing that was unique about this review is that we, historically, I was the board chair, and then Assistant Chief Eric Kasmar was the vice chair. We relinquished that because we certainly recognized, and Chief Magnus gave the direction, that we had damaged community trust. In the rebuilding process, we needed to turn that over. So we had not only did we have you, John, and Mike, have complete oversight of this process, but we also had a facilitator who was a local immigration attorney, co-narrate it with one of our Latina captains, and they had full control, and Eric and I were just there as resources. And so that really set the tone too, of a leap of faith from Chief Magnus and the leadership team to say, hey, look, this is the community's review process. Now, what I would tell you is, because this was all an evolution and everybody was under so much scrutiny, there was even an additional review on our review process to make sure that it was legitimate and it was transparent and there wasn't a cover up, as the leadership team had been accused of. So yeah, if your own city leadership is still, and community is still demanding a review of the review, I would say that there's certainly a lack of trust there, and we were right in the midst of that during this time.
Thanks.
If I could,
Steve, you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to follow. This is really a follow-up on what Chad was just saying. This has really been an encouraging session to listen to, and Frank as well. But I wonder, first to Chad, how does the TPD plan to institutionalize this process? I mean, you've had this wonderful review with immediately interesting results. Is it now institutionalized in the department? What will you do if, God forbid, this happens again?
Yes, it is. It is institutionalized. As it evolves, we update our policy. And so what we learned from this was a far more productive and efficient way of doing it from our transition from a CERB, or the Critical Event Review Board, to the Sentinel Event Review Board. I also want to make clear, lessons learned from this process also continue to update our Force Review Board that is very similar to what we've been discussing today. So even on a random selection of lower uses of force, community has a voice, has a platform, and is engaged in reviewing all aspects of the force that Tucson Police Department deploys. But we do plan, and Chief Magnus does plan, to continue to work with the Quattrone Center and also Michael Scott, which is just north of us. And that was the Center for Problem-Oriented Policing. And that was going to be my recommendation. Anybody listening today, what you take away from the conversation is work with your local law enforcement to encourage them to find a local partner that they can work with. Somebody like the Quattrone Center, somebody like ASU, the Center of Problem-Oriented Policing, because we're at a point in our profession where we have to recognize we need help. Don't be afraid to ask for it, and recognize you have more credibility as a law enforcement organization when you relinquish some of the control to facilitate some of these conversations, and it's extremely helpful.
My other question, because of our audience in particular, is about the role of the press. And this is really to all three of you. These Sentinel event reviews are usually conducted, in fact, they're always conducted outside the radar screen. They're not covered. In some cities, I know reporters have been part of the stakeholder team, but they don't write about it. We often say that the Sentinel review process is in many ways a kind of investigative process, which journalists, of course, are very good at, or you should be very good at. It's one of the skill sets that journalists have. What ways do you see the press can be involved in this Sentinel review process? How could it have been involved in the Tucson process without compromising either side, obviously? And this is to all of you, really.
Well, I think my offering to that would be for the press to be involved after it's over. I think it complicates it for the press to be involved as we're navigating through that. I actually was interviewed by the local newspaper when the process concluded, and I appreciate that, because I think it can taint the process because they may be looking for a storyline that I'm not interested in. And for me, I was after the truth. I was after authenticity. I was after humanizing this entire process and the people that lost their lives in that. So I think it's important to be able to share information with our community, but I think that they should be reserved for the end so that they don't taint the process.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that to anything that would have a chilling effect on people feeling comfortable speaking frankly about mistakes and just difficult things, I think you want to avoid that during the process. And I think everyone, and I know some reporters, and they talk to me for background on mental health stuff, and I like them, but I think always in the back of your mind is, I don't want to see my name in the news with, so anything that chills that discussion, I think we need to not do.
I'll just contribute that certainly in the realm of transparency, media plays an important role. We also have to understand that there's some media organizations who are there to sell airtime, to not facilitate genuine conversation or solutions. It's airtime. So there's a difference from media and there's a difference from journalism in contributing to broader discussion and education about a topic. One of the things that Chief Magnus has worked on the past 5 years is all of our review process, critical event review boards, and the Sentinel Event Review Board are posted on our webpage, public facing, unredacted. That took a while for the internal audience to understand and to kind of wrap their head around. But again, that was a way for us to share information. But I'll agree with both Tonya and Margie that while you're trying to create the safe space, it's difficult to do enough already in managing the conversation and the passion and emotion in those meetings. And I think having the media there would make it even more difficult, if not impossible, for the simple fact we have to recognize, when we asked, Margie and Tonya and Dr. Tang and Claudia Yasso to come into that room with us, and even some of our elected officials who were people of color, they represent people too. And so just some of them being in the room with us came with personal conflict for them with their relationships personally and professionally. And so that's where this conversation's at as a country, where they're it's that hard to have right now. And so I think we just have to recognize where we're at. I certainly think the goal should be a day where we're at a point where we could have those be live streamed, those conversations, because there's so much to be learned. I mean, I consider at this point, I've leaned on Margie for many years as a young cop into where I sit today. But, to this day, I have a relationship with Tonya and Claudia because of the experience that we've had together. And so many other community members that I call friends now that guide my decision-making as a professional in this field.
Yeah, Steve, I think your analogy of this as sort of having an investigative component is actually a useful one to answer your question, right? Because if this had been a crime and we were investigating the crime, I think it's generally important to say, okay, we need to know that you're actively investigating it, but that investigation is going to evolve and take time. And we need to let that evolve so that you get to the best answer you can get to, and then we'll talk about that, right? So I think it might be very useful to have a member of the community who happens to be a reporter and has skills in asking challenging questions be a member and participant in a panel like this, right? There's no reason why those skills wouldn't be valuable. But what I would worry about is if the media is covering the Sentinel event in the ways that Tonya and Margie and Chad described. A, I would worry about it having a chilling effect. B, I would worry about it interfering in the middle of conversations that we have where our views are evolving around what we think is the right next thing to do. And so I think discussing the report to confirm, provide the transparency and the third party evaluation that yes, this was a good faith effort undertaken in the right ways and we're doing the right things here and we're not trying to do a victory lap around a PR stunt. The media is really valuable for that. And I think they could be valuable as participants, but I think it's important to give the room the time to formulate what the new things are we want to change and then report on those rather than interrupting it in midstream, and you run the risk of kind of curtailing the value.
Yes, I agree. I'd like to hear from some of whatever our own fellows think about that, because it's an open debate. The media is both part of the problem and part of the solution. I mean, when you're covering a result of an excessive force, use of force, or a death, whether it's George Floyd or an issue that nobody knows about and therefore is not being talked about in the community, the press are always there, and they're both blamed and not blamed for either making the situation worse or wide opening it up. And it'd be hard to somehow keep them out of a good Sentinel Events review, in the sense that, one could say that the mistakes the press made in coverage or things that it didn't do in covering this were part of the misunderstandings that developed and created some of the bad feelings. I mean, obviously it's an open discussion that we want to keep having.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And let's be really clear. If a reporter does something I don't want, then it's a problem. If a reporter does something I want, then it's fantastic, right? Exactly. So everybody has the challenge of other people being difficult to please, and of a diversity of perspectives wanting different outcomes. I guess what I might say is one of the things that I think is hard for people to get around, and I'm going to drastically oversimplify, Steve, your world, right? But if it bleeds, it leads is kind of what lay people are kind of hearing and thinking a lot. And a Sentinel event process is not an if it bleeds, it leads process. It's a let's take a step back, let's assume the best in people until proven otherwise, and then let's think about how we put officers, in this case, in a better position to succeed in a world where we're constantly talking about transparency and accountability and cynicism and punishment, right? And so for me, if I'm talking to the audience and asking how the media could do things, it would be, I'd be interested to hear the media taking the critical thinking tools that they have and starting from a perspective of, let's assume nobody wanted this to happen until we can find that bad motive and be sure about it, and see if that changes the way we report on some of these stories.
I like to think we're well beyond that now. The if it bleeds, it leads component, although obviously it still goes on. As you'll see later on this afternoon when we announce our awards for this year's crime journalism writing, many of the best stories now do look at some of the systemic causes and the roots of various problems in justice. What is the problem is that because of the limits of what we do and what the media does is we usually end up looking at one person or one issue that is kind of the naming and shaming approach. And whether it's intentional or not intentional, just the headline alone sometimes establishes a environment for discussion that's misleading in an individual community. And we obviously have to work on that. But it's obviously an open debate, but I think we have gone well beyond, the whole idea of if it bleeds, it leads. I mean, I like to think that, and I think most of our journalists, our fellows would probably agree with me that they do want to go further. That's why they're here, and that's why we do what we do.
So there's two quick questions or comments in the chat, and then I'll turn it over to my panelists for any final words. The Quattrone Center did a Sentinel event review of a thing called the Lex Street Massacre in Philadelphia, and the media actually had a big role in potentially contaminating that investigation. So that's available on our website, the report on that, if anybody's interested in it. I don't have the link to post right here. The other one is a question from Don Snedecor, who says, regarding the review board dealing with journalists, do we risk having a reporter embedded being prevented from prompt reporting? And I think my answer to that would be, well, I definitely think if the reporter's embedded, the reporter would be embedded from real-time reporting, but I don't think it would be a barrier to prompt reporting in the event that you could get a report out on the event review before anybody else does upon its conclusion. So it kind of depends on what you meant by prompt, but that's how I would answer it. So we've got about two minutes left before we turn into pumpkins here and our time is up. Chad, Margie, Tonya, any closing words?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a plug for, I know we were talking mostly about the process and not so much what happened in these cases, but I know it's such an issue that's up at the forefront is the role of mental health and policing and alternatives to policing. And there are, in Tucson, part of the tragedy of these cases is we had a lot of stuff in place, much more than many communities have around mental health response. And part of the communication issues that happened was that they weren't used. And so I just want to, for all of the journalists out here, I'm going to put a link in the chat there's a policy paper that I recently co-authored for the National Association of Mental Health Program Directors, along with another officer from TPD and some other experts on the various types of response for mental health, either because the take home is that it's not just one program. You don't just implement cahoots and then you're done. Is that you need a systemic approach on the healthcare side, a systemic approach on the law enforcement side, and they have to collaborate. You'll never get law enforcement completely out of calls involving mental health. And so the question is how to help the response be what the person needs. So that's my soapbox, and I'll get off of it now.
Thanks. Tonya?
Yeah, my last offering would be just to encourage the police departments across the nation to use TPD as a model, quite honestly, and to encourage you to take value in multiple perspectives as they participate in the Sentinel Review. I think that there has to be representation. One of the things that stood out to me is as I walked into the room, when I looked into the city leadership, I didn't see a reflection of me. And so that's an encouragement that that's definitely an area that needs to change, because all of those cultures, that primary culture is what's leading in this field, and that needs to be dramatically changed so that we can minimize these type of events and bring in multiple perspectives.
All right. So I think that pretty much wraps us up.
It does. It does. I want to thank all of you. Thank you, John, Tonya, Margie, and Chad for a really enlightening session.
Steve, can I just say two quick things? One is I want to thank Michael Scott from Arizona State, who was a really valuable participant in this. And I want to acknowledge that Jim Doyle and Maddie DeLone are in the audience, and they really were the creators of the beginning of these processes in criminal justice, and they deserve a serious shout out for that. And I'm sure there are others in the audience too that I might have missed.
They've got the shout out. So
All right.
thank you
Thanks,
all.
everybody.
Thank you all. We'll take a half-hour lunch break, another virtual lunch break. Unfortunately, I can't invite you to lunch at John Jay, but assume that somehow we're all together. We'll see you in a half hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.